He was flat on his back on the terminal floor. That was the image that would stay with everyone who witnessed it. The image that would play on every screen in America before the sun went down that day. The image that 200 people standing in the middle of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport would carry home with them and describe to their families at dinner that night, in voices that still held the disbelief of something witnessed rather than imagined. A uniformed police officer, flat on his back on the polished terminal floor, staring up at the fluorescent lights with an expression that nobody in that crowd had ever seen on a man wearing a badge before. And standing over him, both hands raised so every phone in the air could see them clearly, a black woman in a gray hoodie with a broken carry-on at her feet and handcuffs still locked around her wrists. She was not breathing hard. That was the part nobody could quite explain afterward. She was simply standing there, hands up, face calm, as if she had just set down a heavy bag rather than put a 200-pound police officer on the ground in under 3 seconds. 3 hours earlier, she had walked into this terminal looking like nobody in particular, which was exactly how she wanted it. It was 6:45 in the morning, and Hartsfield-Jackson was already doing what it did every morning, running at a pace that never quite reached full chaos, but never settled into calm either. A constant churning river of rolling suitcases and tired travelers, and the specific noise of a place that never fully sleeps. The smell of the terminal in the early morning was its own particular thing. Jet fuel seeping in through the automatic doors every time they opened. Burnt coffee from the kiosk near Gate B7 that had been burning the same pot since before most of the morning shift arrived. Industrial floor cleaner warming against tile under lights that had the specific flatness of fluorescent bulbs that make everyone look like a slightly unwell version of themselves. Through all of it walked Diana Cole, 37 years old, traveling alone. She wore a gray hoodie that had been washed enough times to lose whatever shape it once had clean but faded jeans and a pair of running shoes that were built for purpose rather than appearance. Her carry-on had a cracked zipper pull that she had repaired twice with a strip of electrical tape. Her backpack slung over her left shoulder had a fraying strap that she had been meaning to replace for 2 months. To anyone watching her move through the terminal that morning, and most people were not watching her because there was nothing about her that invited watching, she looked like a woman heading home from a long shift, or maybe a budget traveler stretching modest savings across a long journey. The kind of person that a crowded airport renders essentially invisible without even trying. She moved through the terminal the way water moves through a room unhurried, never bumping anyone, never raising her eyes, in a way that invited conversation or connection. She checked the departures board once, recalculated the time she had before boarding with the precision of someone accustomed to making rapid assessments, and made her way toward the gate with a patience that did not look like patience, so much as simple, untroubled calm. What nobody watching her could have seen because it lived entirely beneath the surface of every movement she made was the other thing happening simultaneously. She counted exits without meaning to, her eyes cataloging every door and stairwell and gap in the crowd, the way other people notice music, picking out each one and filing it away in some automatic part of her mind that never quite stopped working, no matter how many years had passed. She chose a seat at her gate with a wall directly at her back and clear sight lines to 3 separate doorways. She registered the rhythm of the foot traffic around her, the way a musician registers tempo, noting anything that broke the pattern before she had consciously decided to notice it. These were not anxious behaviors. They were not the symptoms of someone struggling with the morning. They were habits so deeply carved into her body over so many years of living and working in ways she did not discuss with anyone that she barely registered doing them anymore, the same way a person breathes without thinking about the mechanics of their lungs. Her destination was Washington, D.C., where a new position was waiting for her, a civilian consulting role that she had chosen with great deliberateness for the specific qualities it possessed. It was quiet. It was regular. It would not, under any foreseeable circumstance, require her to be anyone other than the most ordinary version of herself. Near the coffee kiosk at Gate B7, a small child dropped a toy airplane on the terminal floor, and the father scooped it up without breaking stride, not even looking down, his hand finding it with the automatic confidence of someone who has performed this particular retrieval 1,000 times. Diana watched this small, ordinary moment with the expression of a woman who has been away from ordinary moments for a very long time, and who is only now slowly learning how to let them register. The gate was quiet enough, a Tuesday morning flight to D.C. that had attracted a modest crowd of business travelers and early risers, and Diana settled into a chair near the window and allowed her mind to do the thing it rarely permitted itself in public, which was to look backward. Not with longing, exactly. Not with regret, though that was in there too, folded into the deeper layers where she kept the things that did not have simple names. More the way you might run your hand along a scar that has long since stopped hurting, not because you want to feel the pain again, but because the texture of it is part of the map of who you are. And sometimes you need to remember the territory. She had been 24 when they recruited her, though recruited was a word she had always found slightly generous for a process that felt more like a door appearing in a wall you had not known contained doors. She had come out of a military intelligence background, having spent 3 years doing work that she was not able to describe in detail to anyone who did not already know what the work was, and someone in the appropriate office had looked at her file and seen something they wanted to develop further. The training that followed was unlike anything she had been through before, even by the standards of everything she had already been through. Hand-to-hand systems drawn from Krav Maga and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and several disciplines that did not have civilian names woven together into a practical framework built not around aggression, but around control. The ability to neutralize a threat with exactly the force required and not 1 degree more. She had been an attentive student. She had learned everything they offered, and then she went to work. The unit she worked for did not exist on paper in any document available to anyone without the highest level of clearance, and even then it was referred to in language so deliberately vague that the language itself felt like a form of erasure. What she did over 12 years of service that consumed her 20s and the early part of her 30s was walk into situations that had already gone badly wrong and walk out again having made them better, or at least having prevented them from becoming catastrophically worse. She extracted people from places where people were not supposed to be extractable from. She prevented things from happening that would have become international crises if they had happened. She operated in cities she was not permitted to name, in countries she was not permitted to acknowledge visiting. The cost of this work was something she had understood intellectually before she began it, and only truly understood in her body about 4 years in, when she realized that she could not remember the last time she had sat in a room full of people without running an unconscious threat assessment of every person present. She missed her mother's funeral because she was on an operation in a country she cannot name, and she made peace with this the only way she knew how, which was to not allow herself to fully make peace with it at all, but to carry it carefully, the way you carry something fragile and heavy at the same time, because putting it down entirely was never actually an option. She had not had a relationship last longer than 4 months across those 12 years. This was not for lack of wanting one. It was a structural impossibility built into the nature of work that required her to be unreachable for weeks at a time, to disappear without explanation, to come back changed in ways she could not explain. She kept no photographs displayed in any apartment she ever lived in, because the apartments were always temporary, and displaying photographs in a temporary place felt like a form of hope she could not afford to maintain. Diana Cole was the name she chose for herself when she left the service 2 years ago, at the end of a meeting that was calm and mutual, and carried the specific sadness of an ending that both parties understood was correct. The people she worked for had given her 3 different names across 12 years, 3 sets of documentation for 3 operational identities. And when she walked away, she wanted something that was simply hers, chosen rather than assigned, belonging to nobody else's file. So she chose Diana because her mother had wanted to name her that, and been talked out of it, and Cole because it was the surname of the woman who taught her to read in an elementary school classroom 30 years ago in a neighborhood that the city had since decided to call something more appealing. The decompression period lasted 6 months. She went to therapy, an assigned counselor she attended punctually and opened up to in the limited way that people who have spent years controlling their interior landscape open up to anyone. Which is to say, carefully and incompletely, but honestly within those careful limits. She took long runs in the early mornings that were the only reliable method she had found for quieting the noise that her body carried. That constant low-frequency alertness that had served her well in the field and served her less well at 3 in the morning in a quiet apartment in a mid-sized city where the loudest sound was the refrigerator. She still trained every morning. Not to maintain a weapon, she had been careful to examine her motivations for this and was reasonably certain of them. But because her body had long since stopped knowing how to feel fully safe without the ritual of it. Jiu-jitsu 3 mornings a week at a local gym where she was known as a serious practitioner, and not much else. Long runs, body mechanics drills she performed in her apartment before coffee, moving through patterns so familiar they required no thought, which was precisely the point. She stood when the gate agent announced pre-boarding, gathered her backpack, and adjusted the strap over her shoulder, the fraying one, the one she had been meaning to replace. She was holding her coffee with both hands, the warmth against her palms, the small, consistent anchor it had always been. And she set it down on the chair beside her and walked toward the gate. And she was thinking in the loose, unfocused way that the morning and the quiet had allowed about the apartment waiting for her in Washington, the east-facing window the listing had mentioned, and what it might look like. To watch the sun come up over a city that was not asking anything of her. She did not know that within 20 minutes, none of that would matter. Officer Brett Calder had been on airport police detail for just under 2 years, transferred from a suburban precinct outside Atlanta, where his personnel file contained 2 use-of-force complaints and the kind of ambiguous performance notes that supervisors write when they want to document a concern without fully committing to the documentation. He was 34 years old, white, built with the kind of broad-shouldered heaviness that fills a uniform in a way that reads as authority from a distance, and he carried himself with the particular confidence of a man who has never been seriously contradicted in a room where he held a badge. His leitmotif was physical and consistent. He kept his right thumb hooked permanently into his belt, just beside his holster. And when he was watching someone, he had already decided something about his jaw moved in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Not chewing exactly, more like a man working through a conclusion he had already reached, but was allowing himself the satisfaction of arriving at again. His colleagues on the detail had noticed this habit without ever naming it. His training officer, a 15-year veteran named Frank Beasley, who had seen enough officers come through the airport to recognize the ones who were going to create problems before the problems materialized, had mentioned it obliquely once in a debrief and watched Calder not hear it. He was not unintelligent. That was important because the easy version of this story required him to be stupid, and he was not. And the harder version required understanding that what made him dangerous was something subtler than stupidity. He was the specific product of moderate intelligence combined with a complete and total absence of self-examination. A man who had moved through the first 34 years of his life, receiving mostly the outcomes he expected, and interpreting each one as confirmation that his instincts were sound. He believed this about himself with the unshakable, undebated certainty that only comes from never having had the belief seriously challenged. His philosophy, which he had never articulated as a philosophy, because men like Calder rarely did, was essentially this. Airports were full of people trying to get away with something, and his job was to see through the performance. He believed this made him perceptive in a way his colleagues were not. In practice, it meant he saw what he was already looking for, and since he was always looking for the same thing, he found it with remarkable consistency. His record at the suburban precinct included those 2 complaints, both reviewed, both filed away without formal consequence. And Calder had absorbed the absence of consequence as proof that his instincts were correct, rather than as the warning the absence of consequence actually was. The first complaint came from a woman named Sandra Mercer, 51, who said Calder had grabbed her arm at a traffic stop when she reached for her registration in the glove box, a movement she had announced clearly before making it. The second complaint came from a 17-year-old named Marcus Webb, who said Calder had handcuffed him outside a sporting goods store for loitering, a charge that evaporated when store surveillance showed Marcus Webb exiting the store with a receipt in his hand, having just spent $42 on a pair of cleats. Both complaints filed, both forgotten. both living in a cabinet that would be opened again sooner than anyone expected. Sergeant Donna Price, 51. Calder's supervisor on the airport detail had told him once, in the informal setting of a shift debrief, that he had a tendency to lead with assumption, a phrase she chose carefully because it was accurate and because she hoped it would land. She had watched it not land. She had not followed up with a formal notation, and this was the decision she would spend several sleepless nights reconsidering after this Tuesday morning showed her exactly what leading with assumption looked like when it had room to run. On this Tuesday morning, Calder was running his standard patrol loop near the International Terminal corridor at 7:12 a.m. His right thumb hooked in his belt when something stopped his eye and held it. He watched Diana Cole moving through the corridor with the unhurried quiet of someone who knew exactly what she was doing and where she was going. He watched her for 90 seconds before she noticed him. And in those 90 seconds, his jaw began its slow, deliberate movement, working through a conclusion he was already finishing. What he saw a black woman traveling alone wearing clothes that did not match the business class corridor she was passing through, moving in a way he described later as too deliberate, like she was trying not to be noticed. He did not recognize and was not equipped to recognize that the specific quality he was reading as suspicious was the professional calm of someone who had spent 12 years moving through far more dangerous spaces than an airport terminal. He was reading the evidence of her competence and calling it guilt. His jaw worked. His thumb stayed hooked in his belt. He turned to follow her at a distance he told himself was observation, and that was already in every meaningful sense a decision he had made about her before asking a single question. Malcolm Osei moved through the international terminal the way successful men of a certain type move through airports, which is to say with his attention split between his phone and his destination, his body navigating the crowd on a kind of autopilot that worked adequately right up until it did not. He was 48, a commercial real estate developer out of Atlanta, and it was during his confident autopilot navigation that his left elbow caught the edge of a mobile display stand near the central corridor intersection and sent his leather portfolio case swinging off his arm. Papers went everywhere, sliding and fanning across a 15-foot radius of polished terminal tile. Malcolm spent 40 seconds gathering them and continued toward his gate. What he did not notice was that one folded document had slid further than the rest, gliding under a nearby bench, where it sat flat against the baseboard, invisible to anyone not looking directly at it. Diana, passing the bench 3 seconds later, saw it from the corner of her eye. She bent down, picked it up, looked around for the person it belonged to. Malcolm was already gone, swallowed by the crowd. She placed the document on top of the bench, where it would be clearly visible to anyone coming back to look for it. The entire sequence took 45 seconds. 2 ceiling-mounted security cameras captured every moment of it from 2 separate angles. Calder, 20 feet back and closing, saw Diana bend and straighten with something in her hand. He did not watch long enough to see her place it on the bench. He was already moving before the scene had finished, already certain of what he had seen, already finishing a story that had not yet begun. Carol Birdsong, 62. A retired school teacher from Dayton, Ohio, was seated at the adjacent gate waiting for a connection to visit her grandchildren, and she had a clear, unobstructed view of the entire corridor. She had watched Diana place the document on the bench. She had watched Calder follow Diana past the bench without looking at it. She noted this the way retired school teachers note things that do not add up, which is to say carefully and with the specific patience of someone who intends to remember. Diana had moved 4 steps past the bench when Calder's voice cut through the ambient noise of the terminal. Not a question, a command. "You picked something up back there that did not belong to you." He said it the way you say a thing you know, not the way you say a thing you are asking about. No inflection of question in it, no opening for her to enter the sentence and change its direction. Just the declaration, flat and certain, delivered from the standing position of a man whose right thumb had not moved from its hook in his belt, whose jaw had resumed its slow, deliberate working. Diana looked at him for a moment, the kind of looking that processes without reacting, and then she said in a voice that was entirely level that she had found a document that had slid under a bench when the man ahead of her dropped his portfolio, and she had placed it on top of the bench where whoever dropped it could find it. and the bench was 12 feet behind him if he wanted to look. Calder did not look. She offered to show him exactly where the document was. She offered to open her bag voluntarily so that he could see for himself that she had taken nothing. Both offers were practical, direct, and entirely reasonable, and Calder refused them both in the space of a single sentence, telling her he did not need her to show him anything. What he needed his tone communicated with complete clarity was for her to comply, and compliance in his vocabulary meant not explaining yourself, not offering alternatives, not meeting his eyes with the expression Diana was meeting them with, which was the expression of someone who is not afraid of him and is not going to pretend to be. Carol Birdsong had put down the crossword puzzle she had been working on and was watching the conversation with the focused attention of a woman who had spent 31 years in a classroom developing an accurate instinct for when something was wrong. She could see the bench from where she sat. The document was on the bench. She could see it clearly, and she could see that Calder was not looking at it, and that the woman he was talking to had just offered to walk him 12 feet to a simple truth, and he had declined. James Whitaker, 23, an airport ground crew employee, operating a luggage cart nearby, had turned off his cart engine and was watching. Calder moved toward Diana and took her upper arm above the elbow, his grip designed to control rather than guide. And Diana, without pulling away, without changing her expression, said in a voice calibrated precisely loud enough for the nearest dozen travelers to hear, "I am cooperating. I have not done anything wrong. Please do not grab me." Several people in the immediate vicinity slowed their pace or stopped entirely. His jaw worked twice. And then he shoved her sideways toward the terminal wall with a force considerably more than the situation required by any measure, hard enough that her backpack struck the wall with an audible impact, and she had to catch herself against the surface with her left hand, her palm flat on the cool tile, stabilizing. 3 phones rose simultaneously. Diana straightened from the wall. She did not escalate. She said in the same level tone, "I would like to speak with your supervisor." Calder told her she could speak with anyone she wanted after she cooperated, and cooperation meant putting her hands behind her back. He announced at a volume that had now drawn attention from a radius of at least 30 feet that he was detaining her for questioning in connection with the theft of property from another passenger. Diana put her hands behind her back. She did not stop talking. She stated her name. She stated that she was complying. She stated that she had not touched any property belonging to any other passenger. She stated the location of the document and described exactly what she had done with it. She said all of this in a voice that was steady and unhurried and loud enough to be captured by any recording device within 15 feet, because she knew, in the automatic way that her training had taught her, to know these things, that there would be recording devices within 15 feet. The handcuffs went on in 2 stages, the right wrist first, then the left, and the second click was tighter than the first by at least 1 notch, which was not an accident, and which Diana registered without reaction, filing the discomfort alongside everything else she was filing. Carol Birdsong stood up from her seat. He wanted to move her, and she was moving with him, and that should have been enough. She was cuffed. She was compliant. She was not raising her voice or struggling against the grip he had on her shoulder as he steered her toward the security corridor at the terminal's east end. A different kind of officer would have recognized that the right move was to get her to the corridor, review the footage, find the document on the bench, and walk her back out to her gate with an apology that would cost him nothing but a few minutes and some uncomfortable swallowing of pride. But Calder's problem was that her pace was not fast enough for him, and underneath that problem was a deeper one, which was that her calmness was not right. She should have been frightened. Instead, she was simply walking beside him with the measured step of someone who had been in worse situations and found them manageable, and the absence of fear in her was something he could not categorize, so he categorized it as defiance, and defiance was something he knew what to do about. He swept his boot against the back of her left knee. It was not a kick designed to bring her down in a single motion. It was the specific, calculated sweep of someone who wants to buckle a person without quite knocking them over, to introduce instability, to communicate physically what he was apparently unable to communicate any other way. Diana's knee buckled. She went down on it, her left kneecap meeting the polished terminal tile with a sound that was sharp and percussive, and carried clearly in a 12-foot radius around them. She caught herself on both hands, the handcuffs biting into her wrists as she absorbed the impact, and she stayed there for a moment, on one knee and both palms, not because she was stunned, but because she was conducting an assessment in the time it took most people to form a single clear thought. The cuffs, the angle, the crowd, the cameras. Calder's position, his weight distribution, his stance. All of this in the time it took Calder to lean down toward her. "Stay down," he said, his voice dropping to the register he used when he wanted to make sure only the person he was talking to could hear him. But Carol Birdsong was close enough, and James Whitaker was close enough, and a young woman named Patel, who had stopped walking the moment she heard the boot connect, was close enough. "Stay down. People like you always make it harder than it has to be." He pressed his boot against the back of her calf, pinning her. A gasp rippled through the nearest cluster of observers, the involuntary collective sound of people who have just seen something they were not prepared to see. 3 phones rose in that same instant. A mother, 2 gates away, pulled her daughter back by the shoulder. Carol Birdsong said, "Oh Lord," in a voice that carried easily through the corridor. Sergeant Donna Price had been in the administrative office at the terminal's west end when the radio traffic started, and she arrived at the edge of the crowd in time to see Calder's boot against Diana's calf and Diana on one knee with her hands on the floor. Price had been in law enforcement for 22 years. What she was looking at right now registered in the specific way that 22 years of experience registers things, which is quickly and without the option of looking away. She said Calder's name, just his name. The way she said it told everyone within earshot that she was not pleased. Calder looked up. He saw her. Something moved in his face, the first hairline fracture in the certainty that had carried him through the last 15 minutes. But he was too far in. The crowd was watching, the phones were up, and men like Brett Calder, when they are too proud to reverse course, do the thing that pride reliably produces, which is to double down and call it conviction. He straightened up. He said loudly for the benefit of everyone recording, "This is a lawful detainment. The suspect was observed removing property belonging to another passenger." He used the word suspect twice, the second time with a particular emphasis that landed in the ears of everyone around him as something considerably less than authority. Diana, still on one knee, said in a voice that was steady and clear and entirely audible to the cameras, and to Carol Birdsong, and to James Whitaker, and to Sergeant Price, "There is a document on the bench behind you. It is exactly where I placed it 12 minutes ago. Please look at it." Calder did not look. Price did. She turned her head. She saw the document, white and clearly visible, sitting on the surface of the bench 12 feet away, exactly where Diana had said it was. And the expression that crossed Price's face contained elements of horror and fury, and a third thing that did not have a simpler name. Calder reached for his baton. He would describe it later as a directive gesture, a means of indicating direction rather than an act of force. And it is possible that somewhere in the complicated architecture of his thinking in that moment, this was true. But his hand was fast, and the crowd read it as a threat, and 3 separate people cried out simultaneously. Diana's body acted before Diana decided. This is the part that is almost impossible to explain to someone who has not experienced it, the way that a certain level of training reaches beyond conscious decision-making and lives in the muscles themselves, in the deep architecture of reflex that is built through repetition, so complete and so sustained that the body stops waiting for instruction. A decade of drilling the same sequences thousands of times under stress, under fatigue, under conditions designed to test whether the movement survived when the thinking mind had too much else to process. And the answer that Calder was about to receive in real time in an Atlanta airport terminal on a Tuesday morning was yes, the movement survived. The movement was the last thing standing when everything else was occupied. She pivoted low off her right knee, the motion drawing power from her hips the way she had been taught to draw it, redirecting rather than opposing, using the existing energy of his forward lean rather than fighting against it. Her hands, though cuffed, functioned as a unit, intercepting his forearm at the wrist before the baton had cleared the holster, applying the specific angle of pressure that makes resistance not just difficult, but mechanically pointless. His own momentum became the mechanism of his own undoing, tipping his center of gravity past the recovery point in the fraction of a second before his nervous system had time to register and respond. He went down. The sound was a single, flat thud. The controlled, precise sound of a large man meeting polished tile at a speed that was sufficient to end the encounter, and no greater, because she had controlled the speed, because that was what she was trained to do. He landed on his back, looking up at the terminal's fluorescent ceiling, the baton still in his hand, because it had never fully cleared the holster. His expression, the specific expression of a man whose understanding of himself has just been removed from beneath him, so quickly that the body has not yet caught up with the event. The entire sequence lasted less than 3 seconds. Several witnesses would later say they missed the middle of it entirely, their eyes simply jumping from Calder standing to Calder on the floor. Diana rose. She stepped back, creating clearance between them, and she raised both hands, the handcuffs visible and plainly unavoidable to every phone and every eye in that terminal. And she said in the same unhurried, level tone she had used throughout the entire encounter, "I am not resisting. I am not a threat." The terminal went silent in waves, the hush traveling from the people closest to her through the clusters farther back, until the ambient roar of an international airport had been reduced in the space surrounding Diana Cole to the sound of the overhead lighting. Calder lay on the floor looking up. Sergeant Price stepped through the crowd, raised her hand toward the 2 junior officers who were moving toward Diana with their hands at their belts, and they stopped. She walked to the center of the corridor, and she stood near Diana, and she looked at her, and Diana looked back. And something passed between them that was not words, and did not need to be. On the floor, Calder was reaching for his radio with the automatic motion of a man who still believed the radio could help him now, still believed that calling for reinforcements would change the fundamental nature of what had just happened in front of 200 witnesses and a dozen cameras. Price stepped past him without looking down, as if he had already become peripheral to the situation she was managing, which, in every meaningful sense, he had. Sergeant Price took the scene methodically and without drama, establishing the perimeter of her authority clearly enough that the junior officers around her understood what she needed from them before she had to ask for it more than once. She assigned an officer to stand at the bench and ensure the document on it was not touched. She assigned another to begin collecting contact information from witnesses, starting with Carol Birdsong, who offered her full name, her phone number, her home address in Ohio, and the specific times she had noted on her watch at each key moment of the encounter. 3 decades in a classroom had left Carol Birdsong with the organizational instincts of someone accustomed to managing information under pressure, and she deployed them now with a calm, unhurried precision that the receiving officer noted specifically in his field record. Then, Price called the CCTV operations supervisor, Raymond Cole, a deliberate and methodical man who had been monitoring terminals for 19 years. She told him what corridor, what time frame, what cameras. He called her back in 6 minutes. 4 cameras had captured the relevant portion of the corridor. Camera 7 showed Diana picking up the document and placing it on the bench. Camera 11, positioned above the bench, showed the placement with sufficient clarity to see Diana's hands setting it down rather than lifting it away. Camera 3 had caught the complete sequence from Calder's approach through to the takedown. Camera 9 had picked up audio from the near distance, capturing both the specific words that Carol Birdsong and James Whitaker had already described. Price watched the footage from cameras 7 and 11, first alone in the security monitoring room without speaking, and then she watched it again. The image was clear enough to see Diana's hands, clear enough to see the precise action of placing the document on the bench's surface rather than taking it away. Clear enough to see Calder walking past the bench without looking at it, after Diana had told him twice the document was there. She asked Raymond to transfer the footage to the large information display screen in the central terminal corridor. When the footage began playing on the central display, the crowd watched it in the specific hush of a group that has already witnessed an event and is now watching the complete version for the first time. The reaction tracked the footage, a low sound of recognition when Diana placed the document on the bench, then a collective gasp, unambiguous and involuntary, when Calder's boot appeared in the frame and the sound of Diana's knee meeting the tile played through the terminal's ambient audio. Someone in the crowd said they saw it, and they still did it, and the person beside them did not respond because there was nothing to add. Meanwhile, Calder had been separated from the main scene and relocated to a secondary security corridor with 2 junior officers where the events of the next 20 minutes would complete his picture of the morning before it fully collapsed. He sat on a plastic chair with his right thumb hooked into his belt, his jaw working in its old rhythm, and he did what men like him do when they have decided the world is against them, which is to build the case for themselves out loud. He told the 2 junior officers that the woman had been acting suspicious from the moment he spotted her. He said her behavior at the bench was consistent with an opportunistic theft. He said his decision to detain her was within his discretionary authority and that the footage would show what he needed it to show. He pulled the precinct laptop toward him, opened the incident report template, and began typing, with the specific, unhurried confidence of someone who has written these reports before and knows which words belong where. He called the incident an aggressive detention, and the detainee combative and non-compliant. He described her as making sudden movements toward a concealed pocket when instructed to show her hands. The 2 junior officers sitting with him had both already seen brief clips of the footage on a colleague's phone, but neither of them spoke. They were in the specific, uncomfortable position of people who know something their colleague does not know, and are waiting, not unkindly, but without the option of warning him for the moment when he finds out. Calder typed. His right thumb came off the belt long enough to use both hands on the keyboard, then went right back where it lived the moment he paused to think. His jaw worked. He was not afraid. He was a man who had filed 37 incident reports in 2 years and never had a single one seriously challenged, and this morning felt to him like an incident report. He was still typing when the first black federal vehicle pulled up to the terminal's emergency access lane. Federal Agent Thomas Reyes had been passing through Hartsfield-Jackson on unrelated business, a connecting flight to Charlotte for a field office meeting, and he had been watching the situation in the central corridor from a distance of roughly 30 feet, with the particular quality of stillness that is very different from passivity. People who have been trained to observe for a living develop a specific kind of watching, one that looks like idle attention from the outside and is nothing of the sort. He watched Diana's response to the takedown. He watched how she held herself in the aftermath. And something in the back of his mind, in the specific archive where trained memory stores things that were presented once and marked as important enough to retain indefinitely, had begun producing a vibration that was heading toward recognition. He stepped back from the crowd, pulled out his secondary phone, and dialed a number he had memorized years ago and never stored in any directory. His hands were not entirely steady, which was unusual enough to register. The call connected on the second ring. He kept his voice low and said the thing that had been building in his mind for the past 90 seconds. "I think I might be looking at Cardinal 9. The person on the other end went silent for several seconds. Not the silence of someone who did not hear, but the silence of someone who heard clearly and is processing the weight of what they have just been told. Cardinal 9 was not a designation spoken casually, even among people cleared to know it existed, because its existence was classified at a level that most law enforcement professionals would spend their entire careers never reaching. He had been present at one briefing years earlier at which the designation had been discussed in a room where most attendees were not permitted to take notes, and the photograph in the file had been partially redacted, and the description he was given had been precise about one thing: the ability to be the most dangerous person in a room while choosing consistently and across years of operational deployment not to demonstrate it. What he had just watched in the corridor was consistent with that description at a level of specificity that made coincidence feel like an argument he was not willing to make. He sent a photograph through the secure app and waited. The response came back in under 4 minutes, and the speed of it told him everything he needed to know about the level of attention this had just generated. Word moved up the chain with a velocity that reflected the nature of the name attached to it. Certain offices in Washington received alerts within minutes, delivered on secure channels to people whose names did not appear in public directories attached to their actual titles. Some of them remembered briefings where her operations had been discussed in the vaguest possible language code names used for locations, outcomes summarized in single sentences that stripped all the danger out of what had actually occurred. Others remembered simply the results of her work, the quiet resolutions to situations that could have become international incidents had she not intervened exactly when and how she did. All of them understood, without needing to discuss it, that this was not a situation to be managed through ordinary channels. In the secondary security corridor, Calder was still typing, his right thumb back in its hook. The moment his hands left the keyboard, his jaw working at its slow, deliberate pace. He had just written the phrase, "The detainee continued to resist verbal commands," when the footage appeared on the large terminal screen, and the sound of the crowd reaction filtered through the glass partition where he was sitting. He looked up. He looked at the screen. He watched himself from camera 3's angle press his boot against Diana's calf while she knelt on the floor with her hands visible. He watched himself lean down. He could not hear what he said from here, but he knew what he said, and he knew the cameras had heard it too. His jaw stopped moving for the first time since the incident began. He looked down at the incident report on his laptop. He looked at the words he had written. The two junior officers beside him were very carefully not looking at him. He was still sitting with this when Deputy Director Harold Voss stepped out of the federal vehicle on the terminal floor and crossed the space with the unhurried directness of a man for whom hurrying is not something the urgency of a situation can impose upon him. He was in a plain, dark suit, no visible insignia, carrying nothing. He did not acknowledge the gathered officers, did not speak to Price, did not pause to locate his destination. He walked as if the room contained only one relevant point, and he already knew where it was. Voss stopped 4 feet from Diana. He looked at her for a moment in the way that people who have worked in classified environments for long enough sometimes look at each other. A specific quality of recognition that carries more history than any single expression can fully hold. He registered the marks on her wrists. He registered the bruise forming along her left knee through the denim. He registered the stillness she was maintaining, the impossible, unforced calm that had apparently carried her through the entire encounter without fracturing. Then he straightened his shoulders, and he rendered a crisp, formal salute in the middle of the Hartsfield-Jackson International Terminal floor in front of 200 civilians who had no context for what they were seeing, and a dozen law enforcement personnel who had varying degrees of context and were finding that their context was insufficient for this moment. Diana met his eyes. She held them for a moment, and then she offered the nod, a single, precise acknowledgement that carried in its economy and its steadiness the full weight of everything that had preceded it. The 12 years, the operations without names, the cost, and the pride that existed alongside the cost, and could not be fully separated from it. The terminal went silent in waves. It was the specific silence that moves through a crowd from a center point outward until the constant ambient roar of an international terminal had been reduced in the space directly surrounding the two of them, to the sound of the overhead lighting and the distant, oblivious noise of passengers at gates too far away to have any idea what was happening. Through the glass partition of the secondary security corridor, Brett Calder watched a deputy director of the United States federal government render a formal salute to the woman he had put on her knee on the terminal floor less than an hour earlier. His jaw did not move. His right thumb, hooked in his belt for so many years that he did it without knowing he was doing it, came free of the belt and hung at his side, the habit broken by the specific gravity of what he was watching. The two junior officers beside him did not speak. They were watching the same thing he was watching, and they had the patience of people who are waiting for a man to finish understanding something that is taking him longer than it should. Voss spoke to Diana quietly. He knew what had happened. The footage had already reached people above the terminal's authority, and well above Atlanta's jurisdiction. She was not under any legal jeopardy of any kind, and he was sorry that she had been subjected to this in a public space on an ordinary Tuesday morning when she was simply trying to get on a plane. Diana listened. She was quiet for a moment when he finished, and then she said the thing that Voss would repeat almost verbatim in a statement to investigators 3 days later, and that would be reported in news coverage for days after that. "I do not need an apology. I need this to stop happening to people who do not have what I have." Voss absorbed this. He held her gaze. He said, in the specific minimalism of someone who understands that there are moments when 2 words do more work than 20, "You are right." Price, standing nearby, did not speak, but the particular set of her expression in the moment after Diana said those words was the expression of a woman who has just heard something she will carry for the rest of her career. The internal affairs investigators arrived at 9:47 a.m., moving through the crowd with the brisk, contained efficiency of people who have been doing this long enough to have eliminated most of the unnecessary motion from it. They went to Price, first, reviewed the footage, reviewed the preliminary witness statements, and then they went to the secondary security corridor where Calder was waiting. His badge was removed in front of the 2 junior officers who had been sitting with him. The process was formal and brief, the language precise and stripped of anything not strictly required by procedure, which somehow made it feel more final rather than less. The physical object of the badge was placed in an evidence envelope, sealed, signed. His radio was taken next. His right thumb rose automatically toward his belt when his hands were free, found nothing there to hook into, and dropped back to his side. He was led from the secondary corridor through the east exit, through the terminal, moving past the tail end of the crowd that had gathered around the information screen. And as he passed the bench, the document was still there, white against the bench surface, exactly as described, exactly as visible, 12 feet from where he had made every decision of that morning. He looked at it as he passed. He did not stop, but he looked at it, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who has run out of the version of events that made him right, and has not yet found a version that makes him anything else. The east exit doors closed behind him. Patricia Hendricks had been running internal affairs investigations for 16 years, and she had developed in that time a hard-won immunity to the impulse to reach conclusions before the evidence had finished presenting itself. She watched the footage from all 4 cameras 4 times in total, each viewing with a specific focal point, and when the footage ended, she said to the investigator beside her, "There is no ambiguity in this footage, none. There will not be a version of this that we debate later in a closed room." Her investigator said, "No, there will not." She interviewed Carol Birdsong first. Carol's account was detailed, chronological, and precisely consistent with the camera footage in every particular delivered in the careful, structured manner of a woman who has spent decades presenting information to rooms of young people who needed it to be clear. She described 2 things with particular emphasis: the moment she watched Diana place the document on the bench, and the moment she watched Calder walk past the bench without looking at it, after Diana had directed him to it twice. She said she wanted to make sure those 2 facts were recorded together because separated from each other, they were suggestive, but together, they were complete. James Whitaker confirmed the same sequence from his position near the east wall, adding the specific detail that he had heard both lines clearly. The accusation about picking up something that did not belong to her, and the words, "Stay down, people like you always make it harder than it has to be," and that he had remained parked because he had decided that his duty as a witness outweighed his duty to his cart schedule. Malcolm Osai reached on his phone before his flight door closed, confirmed the document's ownership, his awareness that he had dropped it, and his certainty that he had never seen Diana anywhere near it, except in the footage where she was placing it on the bench. When the 3 accounts were laid alongside each other and cross-referenced against the 4 camera feeds, the picture was complete and closed in the way that the best evidentiary cases are closed. Not because someone had worked especially hard to construct it, but because the truth of what had happened was simple and consistent from every available angle. Calder was formally notified of his suspension without pay in a small airport administrative office with institutional gray walls. Present were Patricia Hendricks, a union representative named Gary Mouton, and Sergeant Donna Price, who observed without speaking. Gary Mouton had been the union rep for the airport police detail for 11 years and had defended officers through 14 prior disciplinary proceedings of varying severity. He had reviewed the footage before entering the room, and he had come in having already made the calculation that experience teaches there are cases you defend and cases you cannot defend, and the correct identification of the difference between them is not a betrayal of solidarity, but a component of it. He did not speak during the formal notification. This was noted. Afterward, in the hallway, Mouton stopped Calder and told him plainly that the union was not in a position to provide legal representation for this matter, that Calder would need to engage private counsel as a matter of urgency, and that he was not looking at an internal disciplinary proceeding that could be managed through familiar channels, but at a federal exposure that had already generated attention from offices that neither he nor the union had any relationship with. Calder looked at Mouton for a moment, then at the floor, then walked toward the exit with his right thumb hooked reflexively into his belt for about 6 steps, before he seemed to notice he was doing it and let his hand drop. The blue wall had not collapsed dramatically. It had simply, quietly gone somewhere else without him, the way water finds the lower ground, and left him standing in a hallway that used to feel like the inside of a protective institution, and now felt like an ordinary hallway in an airport he no longer had any business being in. By midday, the civilian phone footage was on every major cable news network. The anchors were careful in their language, but the footage itself required no interpretation, and the panels that appeared in the hours that followed were not especially cautious. Former officers' use-of-force experts and civil rights attorneys described what they were seeing with the specific precision of people who had the vocabulary for it. The initial stop lacked probable cause. The physical escalation was not justified by any standard of proportionality or procedure. The compliance strike was applied to a cooperative detainee in a crowded public terminal, and was not defensible under any use-of-force framework any of the panelists had encountered in a combined total of over 60 years of law enforcement experience. Someone pulled Calder's personnel file within 24 hours. The 2 prior complaints surfaced within the news cycle by the following morning. Sandra Mercer gave an interview from her kitchen table in a suburb of Atlanta, describing what had happened to her with the particular restraint of someone who has told a story before and learned that restraint makes it more powerful. A journalist reached Marcus Webb, the former teenager from the mall, now 21 at his community college, and Marcus said, "I knew exactly how she felt when they showed her on the floor. I knew that feeling in my body." The 2 sentences traveled far and fast because they required no interpretation and no context. The Department of Justice Civil Rights Division convened its investigative review 6 weeks after the incident, and the scope of the review was broader than a single event in a single terminal, because the evidence once examined, with the thoroughness that federal resources permitted, made a narrower scope feel like a deliberate choice to see less than was available to be seen. Calder's full arrest record across 4 years was reviewed. The 2 prior complaints were re-examined. The terminal footage was analyzed frame by 2 independent use-of-force experts whose written findings were consistent with each other and consistent with the testimony of every witness interviewed. The detainee had demonstrated cooperative compliance at every point in the encounter prior to the moment of physical self-defense. The officer's actions had not met the legal threshold for justified use of force at any stage. The compliance strike delivered to the detainee's knee constituted unlawful assault under federal statute, and the incident report Calder had filed within the hour of the encounter, describing Diana as actively resisting and becoming physically combative, was directly and comprehensively contradicted by the testimony of 11 witnesses and the footage from 4 cameras. That last item was the one the lead federal prosecutor returned to most often in the weeks of preparation that followed, because it carried a particular clarity about character. The initial encounter could be argued badly, but not impossibly, as a failure of judgment in a pressured moment. The incident report, filed an hour later, when the adrenaline had settled and Calder had sat down with a keyboard and the specific opportunity that reflection provides, was a deliberate choice made with time to think by a man who had apparently concluded that his written account would prevail over any other, and that the word of a badge was sufficient armor against the truth. He was wrong about that, as the footage made abundantly clear. 3 counts under Title 18, Section 242 of federal statute, deprivation of rights under color of law for the unlawful detention, deprivation of rights under color of law for the compliance strike, and filing a false official report in connection with a federal civil rights investigation. His private defense attorney reviewed the complete evidence package and advised a plea with the specific candor of someone who understood that his client's interests were best served by honesty rather than optimism. Calder entered guilty pleas on 2 of the 3 counts. The sentencing hearing was held before Judge Miriam Oakes, a federal bench veteran of 20 years, who approached her work with the understanding that the language of a sentencing hearing was one of the few forms of language that could not be edited or retracted after delivery. She sentenced him to 36 months in federal prison, mandatory minimum, with no parole eligibility on the civil rights count. His pension contributions frozen since the day of his suspension were formally forfeited in their entirety. His law enforcement certification was permanently revoked in the state of Georgia, and the federal conviction triggered the automatic statutory bar that prohibits a person convicted under Title 18, Section 242, from holding any law enforcement position in any state in the country for the rest of his life. Judge Oakes spoke at the sentencing with the unhurried precision of someone who has prepared what she intends to say and intends to say all of it. She noted the documented history of prior complaints. She noted the specific pattern of behavior they reflected: a man who had repeatedly reached for assumptions before evidence, who had repeatedly found that assumptions were not challenged, and who had apparently absorbed the absence of challenge as permission to continue. She noted that the false report filed while the detainee's wrists still bore the marks of the handcuffs represented the arrogance of a man who believed that the written record he controlled would always outweigh the lived experience of the person his badge had been pointed at. She was wrong about that today. Sandra Mercer was in the gallery. She had driven 2 hours to be there and had not told anyone she was coming. She sat in the second row and watched the proceedings with the composed attention of a woman who has waited 2 years for a room to confirm what she already knew. Marcus Webb was there too, in the back row, in the charcoal jacket he had bought specifically for today. He sat with his hands folded and watched Brett Calder stand and receive his sentence. And he did not speak or make any sound, but the expression on his face was the specific expression of someone who has been carrying a weight for a long time and has just watched part of it set down in front of him, and acknowledged by the official record of the state. Calder was turned toward the room to be cuffed. His right thumb rose automatically toward his belt. The habit of years, the leitmotif of a man whose identity had been organized around the presence of a badge and the authority it represented. His hand found the belt, his thumb hooked in, and then the bailiff's hands came around his wrists and took them firmly behind his back, and the cuffs went on, and the right thumb came free of the belt, and it just hung there, reaching for something that was no longer there. Brett Calder served his sentence at the Federal Correctional Institution in Jessup, Georgia. He lost the apartment within 2 months, moved to a cousin's spare room in a city where nobody knew him, and wrote a letter to Sandra Mercer on a Sunday afternoon that took 11 drafts to arrive at something honest. He did not hear back. He had not expected to. He sent it anyway because the thing he was learning slowly and with the specific difficulty of someone learning something late that should have been learned early was that accountability is not something you perform for an audience. It is something you practice in the direction of the people you have wronged, regardless of what they choose to do with it. 3 procedural changes were implemented at Hartsfield-Jackson in the months following the incident. Any physical detention of a civilian in a public terminal now required a second officer witness before contact was initiated. Any incident report involving civilian physical contact required camera footage review before filing. And the probable cause standard applied to object handling in common areas was formally revised to specify that a person handling or moving an object in a public space was not absent additional, specific, and articulable evidence, a sufficient basis for initiating a formal detention. Marcus Webb enrolled in a pre-law program at Georgia State and wrote in his application essay that he wanted to understand the structures that kept producing these moments from the inside where he could do something about it. His application was accepted. 3 months after the terminal, on an October morning in Washington, Diana stood at the east-facing window of her apartment, with both hands around a mug of coffee, watching the city's lights reflect in the early dark before the sun arrived. She still counted exits without meaning to. She still chose seats with walls at her back. She had stopped expecting these habits to leave her and had arrived with the help of some months and some mornings at a relationship with them that was something closer to acceptance than the effortful tolerance she had started with. On her way back from the gym one Thursday, she passed a small park where a father and a small girl were practicing the very beginning of a martial arts form, the girl wildly imprecise and completely committed, her father adjusting her stance with patient hands. Diana slowed her pace and watched them for a moment, thinking of the years of early mornings that had built the thing she had needed in that terminal. All the unremarkable repetitions that had deposited themselves in her muscles like sediment, becoming the foundation of something she had not known she would need until she needed it. She finished her run. She stood at the east window with her coffee in both hands, watching the city below. Somewhere in the ordinary morning, she allowed herself a single private thought, quiet and unhurried, in response to the words she still heard sometimes when the terminal came back to her. People like you always make it harder than it has to be. No, people like me make it possible. She set down her cup. She had work to do, and the morning was hers, and it was enough. If this story stayed with you, drop your thoughts in the comments below. Did Diana handle this exactly right? What would you have done in her position? We read every single comment, and we want to hear from you. If you believe stories like this matter, take a second right now to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so you never miss the next one. Share this video with someone who needs to see it today, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply make sure the right story reaches the right person. We have another story coming next week about a woman who gets publicly humiliated by the man who took credit for everything she built, and what happens when the truth finally catches up to him. You do not want to miss it. Thank you for watching. We will see you next week.